All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I hope everyone's been staying warm and enjoying the snow. My name's Ricky Bentley. I'm the program manager for the Connecticut Land Conservation Council. We are Connecticut's statewide umbrella organization for land trusts. CLCC supports the work of land trusts through advocacy, funding opportunities, technical assistance, and capacity building programs like this one. If you haven't already, I recommend that you subscribe to our newsletter. It's a great way to find out about other educational opportunities and programs like this one. Today's webinar is Prioritization and Invasive Plant Management. We'll explore how land trusts can make thoughtful, strategic decisions about when and why to manage invasive plants, acknowledging both ecological realities and limited capacity. Before we get started, just a couple quick notes. Please feel free to add your questions to the question and answer box at any time. We'll have a dedicated time at the end of Lauren's presentation to go through questions. And also, this session is being recorded, and we will share a link on our YouTube channel in the next couple days. Now, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Lauren Kurtz. She is an invasive plant and horticulture specialist at the UConn Home and Garden Education Center. Thank you all for joining us today. Excited to learn from your experience and perspectives, Lauren.
Great. Thank you for having me. Thanks everybody for attending today. UConn has had a snow day the last 2 days, so I'm at home and I hope you all are home safe too. I've got a lot of snow out there, but we can never not think about the invasive plants that are in our area. So I recently started at the Home and Garden Center. Before that, I was working in a similar position, but within one of the extension offices at UConn. So I'm getting used to a little bit of a new role, but similar content. So some of you may have seen part of this presentation if you were at the Kakiwik conference 2 years ago or so, maybe a little less than 2 years ago. At this point now, I'm not sure exactly, but we'll get started. So we're going to talk about prioritization. First, many of you probably know what invasive plants are, but I'll give a quick overview for those that are maybe a little hairy on the details. We'll talk about management plan and prioritization because you can't really have one without the other. You need to prioritize the plants in your management plan. And if you don't prioritize, you don't really have a management plan. And then we'll talk about some specific management strategies. So the following are the really general characteristics. The specific criteria that make an invasive plant invasive is really something that is largely handled through like the legislature. So in Connecticut, there are 9 criteria that a plant has to meet to be considered invasive. And they are sort of lumped in with the ones that I'm going to go over, but it really does vary by, governing body. But generally speaking, invasive plants are not native. They are introduced accidentally or intentionally to escape cultivation. And many of our invasive plants that we have that are big problems in Connecticut were introduced in the 1800s, some as early as the 1600s. So these plants have been here a long time. And they were introduced for many different reasons, ship ballasts, ornamental horticulture, a lot of different things. So then they escape cultivation and establish in natural areas because of the competitive advantages that they have. So many of them have faster developmental timing, meaning that they leaf out earlier in the spring and they hold their leaves longer into the fall. So they just, they have a longer season of capturing the resources in the area and makes them really competitive. They have higher propagule production and they generally have increased vegetative growth. So they're really, really good competitors. They cause economic, environmental, or human harm. They don't have to cause all 3 to be considered invasive, but they usually cause economic and environmental harm, sometimes human harm. They are listed as invasive by governing bodies. So I kind of said that already. The invasive plant lists vary by state. Sometimes there's like a federal noxious weed list here. Noxious weed is a little bit different than invasive, but we're not going to get into that too much. But for our purposes here, Connecticut has a list of invasive plants. and it is slightly different state by state. So we know a lot of the impacts. They outcompete native species and they reduce biodiversity, mainly by their tendency to form dense monocultures. So they're really good at outcompeting. They just form stands that are just really dense, which makes it really hard for other species to live alongside them. They often have few natural predators or pathogens to keep them in check. They are less productive to ecosystems. So the native flora and fauna that evolved in Connecticut or wherever we're talking about, they did not co-evolve with these plants. So the invasive plants are typically not eaten by any of the invasive insect or any of the native insects. So they don't provide a lot of food or habitat for native wildlife. They can change the natural processes in an ecosystem. So they can introduce allelopathic chemicals into the soil. They can change the pH of the soil. They can change nutrient cycling in an ecosystem. And all these things they disrupt the natural balance of the ecosystem that they're introduced into. And obviously there are economic impacts as well. They are costly to manage. They can lower property values. They can damage agricultural land, degrade grazing land, and they can disrupt tourism and recreation opportunities as well. So although most species that are introduced to a new location don't become invasive, a small portion that do escape cultivation become naturalized. Of those non-native species that become naturalized, even fewer of those become invasive. So this pyramid is just showing that as time goes on, the invasive plant that is introduced becomes a big problem with time. And again, not all introduced plants become a problem, but each level of the pyramid represents a stage of the invasion process. So they are here, they establish, there's often a lag period, which many plants that are introduced stay in this lag period. So they don't end up becoming a problem, they don't spread. The lag phase can last quite a while, sometimes it's decades. There's a lot of talk right now about lag periods, and it's a good way to kind of determine which species are going to become invasive in the future. So many plants hang out in the lag phase and don't go beyond that. But if they do, they spread, they cause ecological impacts and human impacts. So touched on this is the Connecticut invasive plant list. If you haven't seen it, it's good to check it out. You can use the link or the QR code that's there. This was updated most recently last October. The original list was developed in the early 2000s by Les Meerhoff, if you've heard of him. He was the state botanist for a while. He was one of the co-founders of CIPWIG, which is the Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group, which many of you are probably aware of. There has not been a ton of changes to the list since its original introduction, but in the last two legislative sessions, there have been some significant changes. There have been plants that have been added, and there have been plants that have been prohibited from sale. So not all plants on this list are prohibited from sale, but in the last legislative session in 2025, many that were not prohibited were added. And you can see that some of them have a date, like a phase out date, which allows the nursery industry to kind of adapt to these changes. And some big ones that were recently added were burning bush and Japanese barberry, which were not prohibited from sale, very invasive, but now they're on trajectory to be prohibited in a couple years. So this is a scientific and a political document, and it helps land managers prioritize which species they should be managing on their properties. So now we can start kind of talking about management considerations and prioritizing. There's a lot of factors that go into these decisions. It's not black and white. There's a lot of things to consider. land managers typically don't have the resources to manage every single population of invasives. And especially in Connecticut, majority of the land is privately owned. So it's really up to the individual landowners to manage the invasive plants on their properties. And in this case, land trusts. I was recently talking to someone, I was CC'd on an email. He's very, very involved in the land trust in his community. And he told me that land trusts are like second in open space ownership in Connecticut behind the deep. So for you all working with land trusts, you are stewards of a large portion of the open space in Connecticut. So as you are aware, there are a lot of things that go into the considerations of your management. So land use choices, what is the land being used for? And does the presence of invasive plants inhibit the goals that you have for your land? Plant biology, management techniques differ by species and habitat. So some can be easily managed and some are a little bit harder to manage and require multiple years of targeted management to make a significant difference in their populations. We have legislation. Are there requirements for management? In Connecticut, there probably are not. Maybe for some species like bamboo, there's some, legislation behind that, but there's really not a lot of mandatory requirements for managing. We have habitat. So where are the invasive plants? Are they in a habitat that lends itself to management or not? Are they on a steep slope? Are they in a wetland? Are there state or federally listed plants in that area that would make management a little bit more complicated? So economic situation and available resources. Most land managers, we all know, are working with limited time and money and don't always have the resources or money to handle the invasive plant problem. And then we have personal beliefs. So are you comfortable with using herbicides? Are they allowed to be used by your organization? Does your neighbor care about managing invasive plants? Because if they don't, you might have an ongoing problem if you're not managing them alongside your property neighbors. Okay. Now, management planning. I always combine management planning with prioritization. We're gonna go over a management plan, what should be involved in that. That on its own can probably be its own entire webinar or series of webinars, but for now, just kind of do a brief overview. We want to set management goals. We want to do a site assessment. We need to prioritize management within our areas. We need to determine the proper management strategies. We need to restore the area or have a plan for restoring the area or revegetating the area. And then we'll get into adaptive management. So what are based on our outcomes, how do we change management going forward? So the sections of a management plan, again, this could take a whole nother thing, but we're gonna just touch on them briefly. We need an introduction, which introduces the purpose and scope of the plan. It gives a site description of the habitats, the location, the current and past land use of the area, goals and objectives. We need clear, measurable targets. We need measurable objectives and broad goals. A site assessment will include the list of invasive plants and their distribution. And mapping and survey data can be included in the site assessment. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. Management priorities, we want to include criteria for managing or for prioritizing our sites or our species. Control methods, how will we use integrated pest management? What mechanical, chemical, biological, and cultural control mechanisms will we use? Restoration and revegetation. We want to think about stabilizing disturbed areas after treatment and have plans for reestablishing native species. Erosion control, soil health, habitat improvements, all these things are considered in that part of the plan. We need to have a plan for monitoring and evaluation, tracking progress. And for example, are you going to use photo points? Are you going to have vegetation surveys completed every so often? Are you going to take presence or abundance data like yourself, or how are you going to go about tracking what has been done and what how it's looking? And adaptive management, how are your results going to feed back into future actions? And then, of course, timeline and budget, and then references and appendices. This will just kind of organize your plan. You can keep maps and data sheets and permits and all that stuff kind of separate from everything else just to keep it organized. Okay, so now we kind of know what is included in a management plan. We can kind of go into how do we set goals? Like how do we set goals for our land? What do you want to achieve? It's important to have a clear idea of your management goals before you begin invasive species management. It will help you prioritize your work, and it helps you have clear, so you don't get overwhelmed or lose track of what you've already done. It can be really overwhelming to have all these invasive plants everywhere, and you want to manage all of them, but it's just not possible. So if you have clear goals, you can strategically plan how will you meet them. So they can be small, like not allowing any new plants to invade your land trust land. They can be large, like full eradication. Um, there's a lot of options here, but you want to narrow down your goals to a couple so you can realistically reach them based on your circumstances and your access to labor and money and time. Okay, so prevention is very important. It should be like number one priority for your goal. It should be a really large part of your plan. Obviously, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and it's the most effective and low cost solution for managing invasive species. It is very easy to spread invasive species, as many of you know. It can be done by birds, so you can't really prevent that, but there are a lot of things you can do to prevent them. So seeds and plant fragments can easily be spread by contaminated material or equipment, and you want to avoid that. So obviously it sounds easy, but there are things that you can do that are pretty easy that can prevent invasive plants from coming in. So you want to make sure equipment that is coming onto your property is, cleaned if possible, or at least look in all the areas that invasive propagules might hide. If you're bringing in any material like fill or mulch or plants or things like that, you want to make sure that they're free of invasive propagules. If you are using contractors to do some of the work, you can ask them what their invasive plant prevention strategies are, because if they don't have one, then they might be unknowingly spreading invasive plants. And if they do have one, that's great. It just gives you a little extra insurance that you're taking care of what you need to. And then, of course, education campaigns are important. Educating people that visit your land how to prevent the spread. There's some good examples of that. Play, clean, go, clean, drain, dry. There's some good ones. Okay, and then of course you want to minimize disturbance. If you are doing any work, you want to quickly remediate any disturbance with ground covers, some native plants, and monitor invasives that are nearby for preventing them to come to your property. Okay, early detection, rapid response. You've probably heard this too. Very important for invasive plant management. So you want to identify and control small populations before they can become large populations. It's more cost effective, it's more resource effective. So which Japanese knotweed infestation would you manage first? If you're following early detection, rapid response, you would start with the one on the right. So this is in my neighborhood. They widened the road like last summer, and I was walking and I was like, oh wow, that's Japanese knotweed. We should probably take care of that. And you want to manage things when they're small and easy to manage before they become, huge and hard to manage. They cost less, it's easier. The Japanese knotweed that is on the right was probably introduced when they did the construction, whether they introduced it on the fill or the machinery that was done. You want to read the landscape to determine the source of new infestations so you can prevent them in the future. And then the one on the left, like that's going to take a long time and a lot of effort to manage. So this is just one part of prioritization is early detection. If you find something, take care of it early. It should be part of your plan. Okay, invasion curve. Maybe you've seen this. As time goes on, the populations get harder to manage. So, and the control costs go up. So identifying and controlling small infestations before they can establish and expand is more effective than managing large infestations. The site assessment. You want to get to know your area so you can make informed decisions about how to manage it. And you got to keep in mind that the goal is the transition of a landscape. It's not an immediate transformation. This stuff takes time. It takes several years. It takes ongoing work. And you need to assessment leads to planning and planning leads to implementation. So similar to how if you're setting goals, it takes time to reach the goals, and similar here, it takes time to assess the land so you can implement your management. In this picture, it's just kind of basically what a basic site assessment should include. It's mapped populations of different invasive species. You can see the legend. There's autumn olive, multiflora rose, barberry, bittersweet. They're all mapped. Then you know where they are. And at the very least, your site assessment should have that. And it should also have the infrastructure that will facilitate management. So here there's like trails, there's roads, anything that will facilitate you getting there to manage the plants should be part of your site assessment. If you're not familiar with these site assessment resources, you should check them out. They're very helpful when planning any management or even just getting to know your area. The Deep National Diversity Database maps show locations of endangered, threatened, and special habitats. You can find these online. You can organize them by town, and you can take a look at what is a critical habitat in your area, what endangered or federally listed species are there. Some management might require assessment through the NDDB, depending on where you are and what species are there. So something to keep in mind. Another one is the Connecticut Environmental Conditions online map, so CT Eco. Tons of good maps on this catalog that can also be organized by town. This is like a partnership between DEEP and the UConn Clear group. You can find soil maps here, drainage maps, street maps, all sorts of really good maps for site assessment planning. Okay, so now we're kind of getting into the bulk, like prioritization. Triage is, used in medical context to prioritize management of treatment of patients. So you're using the fewest resources to get the best outcomes. So there's like steps in this process. So it's basically a systematic assessment. You got to assess the area. You got to prioritize. You have to develop your prioritization criteria. And then you have to strategically treat or manage the affected areas based on your prioritization criteria. You get to choose what you use as your priority criteria. This is an example of the Fish and Wildlife Service with the California Invasive Plant Council. You can find this online. I found this, it just gives you kind of a visual of how where they prioritized management. Their criteria included abundance of rare or at-risk native species, so similar to how we would find the DEEP NDDB maps. They used that information. They used level of invasive plant abundance, risk of future invasion, and previous investment in management to prioritize their regions. And your prioritization criteria will vary based on the organization, the project, and the goals that you set for your project. So things to consider when you're developing your prioritization criteria, the ability to achieve effective control. Is the species that you're dealing with easy to control, or is it hard to control? The impact the invasive plants have already had on the site. So how degraded is the site? And the health of native species or communities at the site. If there are, very little native species present at the site, that might change kind of how you prioritize that area. How easy is it going to be for you to invite those native plants back? So I kind of touched on these already, but some prioritization criteria, some options. Ones that I haven't said yet is ease of control. We kind of said that. The value of the habitat being invaded. Is it kind of just like a median, like a highway median? Like that's not that valuable of habitat. Maybe it is, depending on where you are, but you kind of have to consider some of those things. Social factors is an important one that I will get into in a bit. So not always considered when you're prioritizing invasive plants, but it can be a powerful prioritization tool. So if you're not familiar with UConn fact sheets, there's a lot of good information out there. This one, we published it about a year ago now. So you can find it, you can use the QR code there. You can probably also just Google the title, Invasive Plant Triage for Habitat Managers in Connecticut. It kind of gets into some of the stuff that I'm presenting, so you can have like a handout if you're interested in reading more about this. So this is available on the fact sheet if you want like a handout to look at how to prioritize and kind of what it means based on the criteria that are set forth here. So here we used how large is the population, and there's ranks from 1 to 5. So 1 was none, but there's a population nearby. And then 5, it's covering the whole area completely. So you kind of want to go through each species or habitat or area and just kind of rank these things out and add up the scores. And if your score is lower, then it's a higher priority based on this criteria here. So another one, so the first one, how large is the population? Then we have the value of the habitat being invaded. It's a really important habitat with high biological diversity. Then that's more of a priority to manage than a habitat that's like really degraded with very little diversity. The impacts of the invasive plant. It's changed the area so much that few native species are present, or it's invading disturbed areas like edges, which, there's some debate on edges. Are they good to manage? Or are they kind of just always going to be an issue? So, you kind of got to score your priorities and come up with some sort of strategy to handle it, because you can't do it all. So this is kind of just a visual of if your criteria was the amount of invasive plants present in an area, you would want to start in an area that had a lower population. That core infestation in green is going to be a lot harder to manage, and it's going to cost a lot more. It's going to take a lot more time. But if you start in the area in red, where there are fewer invasive plants, one, your habitat's probably not that degraded. It's going to be easier to restore, and you're going to be able to see results more quickly. So you really want to start in areas where invasives are few and work towards areas that they're more plentiful. And then in those heavily infested areas, if you have a hard time just ignoring them completely, you can maybe use strategies that are less time consuming or less effort, like mowing. Like maybe you can just mow the area to prevent seed set. So you can use least intensive management options in those core infested areas. So you're doing something, but you're not really whacking it with all you got because it's just going to take a lot more than those less infested areas. Okay, another visual example of this. A high priority site is one that's easily accessed, where the population can be managed effectively, and the native habitat's not completely degraded. So on the left, in that red box is a little patch of Phragmites in a otherwise like pretty nice habitat with a lot of native species. So if you had the right permission, the right permit for aquatic herbicide use, and the right herbicide, aquatically labeled herbicide, you could probably hit that in 1 year, and you would handle that before it became a bigger problem like the one on the right, where it's difficult to access. The invasive population won't be easily managed, and that habitat's probably so degraded already, it would be really hard to return that to a really functioning part of the ecosystem. Certainly not a lost cause, the low priority site, but just knowing if you have limited resources, where are you going to put them? You should put them in places that they'll make a bigger difference in the long run. All right, and you want to implement your management at high priority sites first. So this might take 2 to 3 years of repeated management. It can be hard to identify high priority sites and difficult to ignore low priority sites, but knowing how long it takes and how resource intensive it is, it really just puts things into perspective. You're more likely to see improved biodiversity at less infested sites. You want to always ongoing monitoring of the site. You want to know that what you're doing is making a difference. And if it's not, then how do you change it to get the results that you want to see? So the conditions can change, and environmental conditions can change, and you got to adapt your management sometimes. So so a site with public interest, this is like the social factor of prioritization that I mentioned. So the Westbrook Garden Club adopted this area and they made a meadow walk. And before it was the meadow walk, it was just like this really degraded, heavily infested area. In town, it was pretty close to some like municipal buildings. There was like a trailhead nearby, a lot of sidewalk traffic. And the garden club decided to adopt this area because it had a lot of public interest, and the public interest motivated people to get involved. So they used a social factor to prioritize their location for management. And now this site has a lot of native plants. It's a really nice little trailhead area, and it can be used to inspire future management. So not all prioritization has to be ecological. It can have social factors too. You are going to want to consider what's going to take the place of the invasives that you're managing. You want to monitor for the return of native species. Some will return on their own if nearby populations are there to facilitate spread. But sometimes you have to step in and plant native species. And I say plant native ecologically relevant species. So you got to look at the habitat that you're in, or what was historically the habitat that was there. Just because a plant is native doesn't mean that it's going to thrive anywhere. It has a niche just like anything else. So you gotta know what the conditions are and plant plants that are going to thrive in those conditions. And particularly, you want to use plants that are easy to establish. So you don't want to pick the plants that are really novel or like really delicate or like have really tight habitat considerations. you want to plant the plants that will, grow and spread and take over space quickly. And you can do this by planting plugs, seeds, container plants, bare root trees, and shrubs. A combination of all of them is probably a good choice. And some of these, I just listed some companies there that do that sort of thing. So I don't think I have a slide here on this presentation for it, but competitive exclusion is something that it's used in ecology. It's basically like only one species will eventually one species will survive in a niche. You can't really have two species that are trying to compete for the same resources. So you want to choose native plants that will take over the spot that the invasive plant was taking over. So, a good example I like to think about are, you have Phragmites, you have cattails. They both kind of grow on the edges of wetlands. Cattails aren't as aggressive as Phragmites, obviously, but they would be a good replacement for places that you're managing Phragmites, plant some cattails there. Or swamp loosestrife is another one that kind of grows on the edges of wetlands that are a really good placeholder for some of the invasives that we're seeing. Canada goldenrod, great one. It'll take over. You gotta choose plants that are gonna sort of compete with the invasives from returning. And you can then, once you've chosen your priorities, you've managed at your high priority sites, you've revegetated or started the revegetation process at your high priority site, and then you can move on to lower priority sites as your resources allow. So what makes this site a low priority? Well, this site is in like a residential area in a lake house community. And many of the neighbors in this community have burning bush in their yards. So this wouldn't really be that high of a priority to manage if, 6 out of 10 neighbors have a burning bush in their yard or multiple burning bush in their yard. You're going to take these plants out and something's going to need to replace them. And it's probably going to be more burning bush in this case. So, and this habitat's also an edge, which I touched on a little bit. Edges are always going to be sites of disturbance. They're always an invitation for invasives to come in. Managing edges can protect interior woods, but they're always going to be a hotspot. So you could do certain things in this area that would be kind of a low effort. You don't have to go in, yank out all the plants, replant immediately with native species. That would take a lot of resources. What you could do is maybe cut them down here and there every couple years to really reduce the seed bank. And sometimes when you cut one down, you are opening up the sunlight to hit the seeds that are lying dormant in the soil. So you gotta it's hard to prioritize things. And once you start managing, you got to keep going, because if you don't, it's just gonna, there's always going to be more that are going to come in. Which leads me to the invasive species treadmill. You remove an invasive and another one takes its place, or the original just comes back. So when you're managing invasive plants, you're creating disturbance, and weeds really like disturbance. So if you're creating if you're creating bare ground, something's going to want to live there. So you gotta, it's just something to be aware of. And then legacy effects can also keep this problem happening. So that's legacy effects of the invasive plant itself, such as allelopathy. So if an invasive plant is allelopathic, it's creating chemicals that it puts into the soil to inhibit the growth of other plants. So this can affect your revegetation. So if there's a ton of allelopathic chemicals, you might have a harder time establishing native plants who might be a little bit more sensitive to those allelopathic chemicals. Or if you're using herbicides, for example, that are persistent. They might prevent other plants from growing there for a couple years, which could be beneficial, but it also could be harder to establish other plants in that area. So you just got to keep that in mind. If you're not revegetating the area after you're removing the invasives, you're more likely to see invasives coming back. And especially if there's a strong seed bank. So if those invasives have been there for a long time, you gotta keep the seed bank in mind, because it's gonna be, that's part of the reason invasives are so successful, is they produce a lot of seeds. So you'll have to just continue with monitoring and maintenance for positive outcomes long term. So adaptive management, you want to adjust your management strategies based on real-time outcomes or changing environmental conditions. So is the management strategy that you're using not working year to year? You can change it. You don't have to keep doing it just because you set out to do it that way. Was there a flood one year? Was there a drought one year? These things can affect your management, and they can you can change them so they work differently based on real-time outcomes. And this requires monitoring and evaluation, of course. So you have to you can't just spray or pull a bunch of plants and think that that's the end of the story, because it's not, and you have to continually monitor and evaluate for success, and change your plans if you need to. Okay, we have challenges. Ecology is complicated. Our best practices are usually based on site conditions. You always have to be open to learning and researching new things, and be open to asking for help when you need it. Time and money obviously is a factor. It costs a lot of money and time to do these things, and you have to have the people to do the work. And if you have limited staff and volunteers, are you able to train them properly? You might have to invest in training up front, maybe invest more time training up front so you can have longer term volunteers. And then of course you have deer, a big problem when you're revegetating an area. Deer don't really browse on a lot of invasives, as many of you probably know. They really prefer the natives, and they will choose them over the invasives, especially young, tender native plants that you're just planting, just trying to establish. You have to have a deer plan, or I don't know, strategy. There's some fence, you can get different fences, you can use different products to keep the deer away from your newly planted plants. It's always going to be a problem. Deer are always going to be there. It's going to be hard to really effectively manage the deer in the area. They're always going to come back, but just knowing that they are going to eat your native plants, you have to have some sort of protection in place so they don't just totally devour everything that you plant. So I've kind of touched on some of these already, but some unintended consequences of invasive plant management activities. You can't always prevent them, but knowing that they are problematic can help in your planning. So soil disturbance, compaction from heavy machinery, erosion from getting rid of invasive plants can cause erosion. So you have to plan for that. You might need to plant like a quickly growing ground cover, even if it's not a native, some quick to establish grasses, so they, all your soil's not running off in the next rainstorm. That will impact water quality. So you want to make sure you're not harming your non-target plants. So that a lot of that has to do with your planning initially. So you have to train your people to avoid the non-target plants when you're managing your invasives. So all these things should be considered. They don't all some of them are just inevitable, like you just have to kind of handle it as the outcomes like present themselves, but it's just things to be aware of as you're developing your plan and your prioritization criteria. Okay, so we need to just determine specific management strategies. This is kind of like the second half, not half, it's not as long as the first half, but this is kind of where you get into the nitty gritty of what am I doing? Like I have all these plants, how do I manage them? I've prioritized my areas, and now I need to, how do I manage them? So integrated pest management, if you're not familiar with that, it's a combination of prevention strategies, mechanical methods, chemical methods, cultural methods, and biological methods of management. Biological, there are some biological controls for invasive plants, mile-a-minute, purple loosestrife, and they kind of just exist out there. Some people are introducing biological controls into areas to handle invasive plants, but most of the time people are focusing on the other four. You have to do your research. There's no one size fits all approach to this. And the management strategy varies based on the species, the location, the time of year, the resources available, all these things. So you need to get to know the plants that are in question. Are they aquatic? Are they grasses? Are they herbaceous? What kind of plant is it? How does it grow? Is it an annual, a perennial? You need to correctly identify the plant and the growth form, and this can help you develop your management program. There are many resources available to help you ID plants. Invasive plants aren't particularly difficult to identify, but you do definitely want to know what you're dealing with before you attempt control measures. So how does it spread? Does it spread by seeds, rhizomes, plant fragments, all of the above? Knowing how these plants spread will inform your management, and it'll also inform your disposal. So disposal is often not really thought about early on, but it is important. So you want to learn the biology of the plant so you can exploit its vulnerability. Is it an annual that you can quickly pull before it goes to seed? Is it a rhizomatous plant that you can't really pull because it's just going to spread through its rhizomes? You really just have to know what you're dealing with. SIPWIG, again, the Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group, developed this management calendar that has the top, I think it's 10 invasive plants and different management practices, and when is the best time of year to complete them. So you want to go based on this calendar as a general guideline, but don't get caught up in paralysis by analysis. Oh, I'm finding this new invasive plant in November and it says I can't manage it now. I mean, the best time to manage your invasive plant is right now. So, don't get too caught up with this, but there are some species that it is particularly important to follow, especially for pulling, mechanical removal, hand pulling, cutting. You want to do those before the plants go to seed. So I'll kind of go into that a little bit more, but that's a consideration. You want to manage before things go to seed. Some plants like tree of heaven, it's really susceptible to herbicides in the fall when it's bringing resources down into the roots. So if you're going to use an herbicide on tree of heaven, you want to do that in the fall. Similar with Japanese knotweed, any plant with rhizomes, it's moving its nutrients and energy stored reserves into the roots in the fall, and that's a good time to spray them if you're using herbicides. Okay, so a couple of quick mechanical control methods. They can be used alone or in combination with other methods, but again, best done before the seeds form. You really don't want to move seeds off site if you can prevent it. So cutting is really effective at delaying or preventing seed production. Cutting and mowing over time, if done over time for many years, can potentially kill plants. But it can give you instant gratification, but it's likely that the plant will regrow from the roots. Mowing is effective at shortening the vegetation for another management to follow, like herbicide use, if that's where you're going. So it's helpful to mow things down and make them smaller so they can regrow and you can treat the regrowth. Pulling is easy for some plants, not others. And you have to know like when it's effective to pull things out. And then suffocating, I'll get into some details on that. So when you're pulling and digging plants, weed wrench is a really cool tool. If you've never used one, you should get one. They're easy to pull like single stemmed small trees and shrubs out. Pulling is easier to do in the spring because the soil is moist and easier to work. So the plants come out easier. You can pull annual plant invasions easier than perennial plants. So mile a minute or stilt grass can pull those out. That's a really effective management strategy for annuals. Anywhere small scale where you don't want to use chemicals. So you can certainly hand pull, Japanese barberry. You got to wear gloves, but you can pull it out, and it's not that hard to pull out. But you just have to know, like, if you're managing 10 acres, are you going to manage 10 acres of barberry by hand pulling? Maybe not, but maybe you have the power to do that. It's just, you got to consider all of your options. Mugwort, on the other hand, it's really hard to pull out. So Japanese knotweed, really hard to pull out. So you got to kind of know where to put your effort. Cutting or mowing. You can do this 3 to 4 times a year for up to 5 years, and you will, you're essentially starving the plant of carbohydrates. So sometimes it will kill the plant, sometimes it won't. It may eventually exhaust the reserves. Many plants will be encouraged to regrow if they are cut or mowed. So just keep that in mind, especially plants with rhizomes or plants that will sucker from their roots. And it requires persistence and commitment. So often mugwort and Japanese knotweed are frequently mowed like along roadsides for visibility. And that's really not done to effectively kill them. It's done for visibility. So just kind of like knowing your goals, and that mowing can actually encourage Japanese knotweed to spread. So just something to keep in mind. Cutting woody vines can be very helpful for mature trees, and it is a short-term strategy to get a handle on tree canopy that's being jeopardized by bittersweet. So you can certainly cut vines, and that's helpful. It will kill the top growth of the plant, but generally it's going to regrow from the roots. It will help reduce the seed production and minimize strangulation of the tree. It's not advised to pull vines down after you've cut them. If they're up in trees, it can be dangerous to do that. Suffocation is a non-chemical method for another mechanical method. So buckthorn baggies are something that you should consider if you've never heard of them. They're just a very thick plastic bag that you cut down a shrub. Usually it's a woody shrub like buckthorn, or in this case, this picture, it's burning bush. And you zip tie the baggie onto the stump, and it prevents the regrowth from getting the sunlight and oxygen that they need, and it will kill the plant over time. It's really helpful for like sloped areas or that places that it's hard to get to, or it can cause erosion if you're pulling things out. So it can be really helpful for that. Works on woody shrubs mainly. Another suffocation method is arborist wood chips, or arborist wood chips in combination with like landscape fabric or cardboard. The thing with arborist wood chips is it needs to be a very thick layer, so that it's really helpful for mugwort. If you put it in like a thick layer, at least 12 inches, it can suffocate other things too. Thick plastic can also be used as suffocation, but you have to just be aware that it will break down over time and you want to remove it before it breaks down and makes a big mess. Okay, chemical control. You obviously want to follow all the label directions. The label is the law. You need to hire a professional or know when to hire a professional or consult with one to not get yourself into trouble. And you want to use quality resources that have been vetted or made by subject matter experts. And when you're using chemicals, you need to read the label because not all just say, oh, I heard glyphosate can be used for this purpose in this location. If the product that you're buying doesn't have that specific use on the label, that's actually not, it's not legal to do that. You have to read the label of the product that you're using and make sure that it's has the application method that you want on the label so you can use it that way. You always want to wear your PPE, and if you're mixing your own herbicides, you want to use a dye so you know if it's leaking and you know where you sprayed so you're not over applying. And you are required to put some sort of signage where you're applying herbicides. Foliar is an application method. I don't love recommending foliar applications because I think it can cause a lot of overspray and be damaging to non-target plants. But you can use it on a wide variety of plants, annuals, perennials, shrubs, grasses, small trees. It's a very kind of a one-size-fits-all option, but that is also what makes it kind of a problem if you're overspraying, if you're not careful. The type of equipment and herbicide will vary by your situation. So I'm not going to give you specific, use this for this, because it really depends. But glyphosate, triclopyr, imazapyr, and I'm forgetting the other one. They're all common foliar herbicides that you can use. A 4-gallon backpack sprayer is a general all-purpose great use of for foliar applications. You always want to mix according to the package directions and make sure that you're not applying more than is on the label directions, which is particularly important when you're using these methods, basal bark, cut stem, hack and squirt. If you're using these methods, you're using a higher concentration of the product. So you might not even dilute it, or you might dilute it a little bit. And there are regulations on how much you can use per acre usually. So if you're using an undiluted product on a large scale, you have to really be careful of how much chemical you're putting into the environment. You really just need to follow the directions on the label. Basal bark is really good. You're just treating like the bottom 12 to 18 inches of the stem with an herbicide. Cut stem is really good for vines. You're really just applying a really targeted amount of herbicide just to that inner cambium layer. And then hack and squirt is similar. You're just disrupting the vascular tissue to apply the herbicides, and then gets in there. There's a lot of information about these online if you're not sure, you never heard of them. Different plants lend themselves to this differently. Like if you don't want to cut your tree down, basal bark's a good option. If it's a tree that suckers a lot, like tree of heaven, if you cut it down, it's going to promote suckering. So hack and squirt is a really good option for that. Not that no suckers will come, but fewer will. Disposal, again, not always considered upfront, but should be considered. You got to know which plants are going to easily reroot if you leave them on site. So if you make a big brush pile, which plants are gonna grow from the pile, no problem. If mature seeds are present, you want to consider if removing them to like a dump or a compost pile or something like that will encourage their spread to new locations. So you want to try to do your management before seeds are set, if possible. You want to know what your trash collection service will accept if you're planning to go that route. Most of them will not accept invasive plants into their like yard waste piles. So just know that. Don't try to, bring them there and act surprised. You can bag a lot of plants. Like if they're seeds, you can bag them and send them to the dump if they are incinerated. If your dump incinerates the garbage, you're pretty safe to send it there. I know, like on a large scale, we're talking land trusts. It's probably hard to do that. So you can solarize them, leave them on site to decompose so they become not viable, and then You can make brush piles if you want, like here, that Japanese barberry. I pulled it out, I kind of hung it in the crook of a branch. So there's no contact with the soil. The plant will die up there and you can dispose of it that way. You just got to consider your disposal. Okay, some of you maybe are aware of this. Myself and a colleague of mine, Alyssa Siegel-Miles, have been working on this course for a while now, probably 2 years in the making. So if you are interested in this topic and want to learn more, get a more in-depth understanding, you can sign up for this course. It's asynchronous. It starts next week, but you can register until February 27th. So if you need more information about that, I'd be happy to answer some questions about that. You can scan the QR code or get the link there if you're interested in learning more about this. And thank you very much. It's a lot to cover, but I hope I gave you some sort of information so you can kind of plan your management and at least get you started on where to go from here. So if you need my email, you can contact me there. I'm happy to take questions.